Chapter 23, Under Siege. I just got a new job that I love, but I have been very busy. Updates will probably slow down for a while. Heir of Slytherin is on 52 C2s. Thanks. Draco checked his school bag for the 5th time that day. The copy of the confidential ministry report was safely tucked away. With the ministry as leaky as the Weasleys' roof, here he mentally smacked himself. He did not want to slip up and say that in front of Potter. It was only a matter of time before this confidential report was front page on the Daily Prophet. Draco thought Harry really ought to know before everyone and their Kneazle did. He watched until Harry finished his breakfast, timing his own exit to coincide with Harry's, and gave the Gryffindor a significant look. Harry nodded and followed, blending into the crowd, avoiding the searching eyes of his fellow Lions with an ease Draco had to admire. Tucked into a small alcove, Draco handed Harry the slightly battered report. Look, read it when you have some privacy, alright? He didn't want to break such terrible news right before Harry had to be in class. Looking confused, Harry nodded. Thanks. Heeding Draco's vague warning, Harry holed himself up in a dusty window seat behind moldering curtains, casting a few privacy spells he'd learned this summer. Draco had looked almost pitying as he handed Harry the scroll. Nervously drying his sweaty hands on his trousers, he unrolled the scroll. Ministry of Magic. Date, August 10, 1995. Ministry Personnel: Obliviator Geoffrey Milhouse, Master Leslie Ashton, Brooke Waverly, John White. Location, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, home of Muggles Petunia Dursley, Vernon Dursley, Dudley Dursley, and Wizard Harrison James Potter. Disturbance: Muggle Margaret Dursley found kissed by a rogue Dementor. Muggle emergency personnel on site. Obliviations: none. Muggle healers diagnose Miss M. Dursley with a fatal heart attack. Dursley family exempted from statute of secrecy due to relationship with Mr. Potter. Other actions: search for Dementor in progress. No leads thus far. Observations: wards of Dursley family home severely damaged. Assured by A. P. W. B. Dumbledore that Mr. Potter was not in residence. Dursley family refused Muggle medical treatment. Recommendations: local magicals should be alerted. Personnel experienced with Dementors should be made available to patrol and search. Harry's hands trembled as he read the terrible words over and over. Margaret Dursley found kissed. Dimly, Harry thought he should feel guilt, or grief, but all he felt was fear as someone had sent a Dementor after him. And relief that the woman would never set her awful dog on him again. He clenched his jaw, remembering the horrid things the woman had said about his mother. She deserved it. Something dark and angry inside him whispered. Draco settled himself into a squashy green armchair. Aaron Montague and Melinda Grayson, 7th years and the unofficial but respected, and feared, leaders of Slytherin House, stood by the immense stone fireplace, waiting patiently for the house to assemble. The youngest students settled onto the floor, cushioned by rich rugs and pillows. The traditional "you are now a Slytherin, so act like it" speech had been given after the welcoming feast. It was unusual, to say the least, to have another house meeting so quickly. When the last students were seated, all fell silent, looking at the 2 7th years expectantly. Grayson said, with no preamble, "Umbridge gave her first detention tonight. Reliable sources report that several students were commanded to write lines with a blood quill." She paused a moment to let that sink in. "Umbridge will be forming some sort of student organization designed to provide her with the manpower to harass Dumbledore and further her own agenda. If you are invited, you will join. Otherwise, keep your heads down and your noses clean. Keep your opinions inside the house dorms. 4th years and down. Dismissed." The younger students quickly rose and scampered out. After the door closed behind the lower years, Montague said, "I won't have kids tortured on my watch. If they know we're actively protecting them, they'll be tempted to act up." He smiled fondly. "Cheeky buggers. So, us upper years are going to lick Umbridge's feet if that's what it takes." As an actual teacher, she seems pretty undemanding, he sneered. "Tempting as it is, do not go out of your way to throw the other houses to her. Hogwarts is under siege, and we might need them." Dismissed. Malfoy. A word. Draco's mind was spinning. A blood quill. Remembering Potter's little outburst in class, he shuddered. When the room was finally empty, Montague turned to him. "He won't be pleased about Potter's detention," the chaser said in a subdued voice. "The Montagues, Draco recalled. Were not yet sworn to the Dark Lord, but they were definitely being recruited. Draco said quietly, she's got a grudge or an agenda. She was definitely provoking him. Better and better, Montague murmured sarcastically. Tapping his fingers restlessly on the mantel, he finally said, there's not a lot Grayson and I can do. Let us know if any of ours are setting other students up for a fall. Would you trust anyone else in the house to run interference? Draco nodded. Bulstrode. She's smart and crafty, and she and Potter seem to get on pretty well. Crabbe and Goyle will do what I tell them. Keep an eye on Parkinson. She has a chip on her shoulder, warned Potter. Maybe you can convince him to keep that damn Gryffindor mouth buttoned. They both snorted at the likelihood of that. Eddie Carmichael felt sick. He'd no idea the ministry overseer would be so beyond common decency. A blood quill, of all things. The ministry was moving against Albus Dumbledore, and all of Hogwarts stood in the middle. He caught the gazes of other and the no-eagles. They'd study their foe. Further knowledge would yield greater understanding. Harry stared pensively at his hand, sunk into a small bowl of slimy murtlap essence. Hermione lifted her wand and murmured a spell, transfiguring the bowl so it was hand-shaped and the perfect size. Thanks, Hermione, Harry said, wiggling his cramped fingers. What did Professor McGonagall say? Hermione asked. Harry shrugged, feigning indifference. She wasn't very helpful, blathered on about this not being about the truth or some such rot, he said. Hermione's shoulders slumped. They're all running scared from Umbridge, aren't they? Harry nodded. You seemed upset. About more than this, she said, gathering a little of the slimy stuff on her fingertip and smearing it gently onto the back of his hand. Harry sighed. Leaving his injured hand in the soothing goo, he leaned over and groped under his mattress. Finally finding the now much mangled scroll, he handed it to Hermione. She read through it rapidly, then looked up. Oh my, Harry, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? He shrugged. I'm fine. She wasn't my aunt, you know. She was Dudley's. She didn't like me. Harry's voice got thicker as he continued. She had this horrid dog, Ripper. He'd chase me and she'd laugh. Hermione gently wrapped her arms around him, pressing his face into her shoulder while he cried. The first Friday evening of the school year found Severus Snape fussing about in his small sitting room. He'd hoped to have a pleasant chat with his son. The word son still made his stomach clench, but his observation of the Gryffindor Quidditch team's disastrous first practice had all but dashed that hope. Still, he'd felt a foreign delight in watching Harry chase the snitch. True, he'd probably gotten his skill on a broom from Potter, but that keen eye and narrow focus on his objective had most certainly come from him. He hoarded these tiny glimpses he caught of himself and his boy. He laid out a tray with cocoa and a few of Madame Puddifoot's special cream cakes. Her award-winning cakes could be purchased nowhere else, so Severus had ventured into that simpering little shop. Perhaps the treat would put Harry in a pleasant frame of mind. His wards chimed, leaving him a few moments to complete his preparations before Harry knocked on his door. Come in, he said, gesturing the boy towards the small table. He noted Harry's tidy appearance with approval. Usually he was somewhere between street waif and slovenly unless in his Hogwarts uniform, but tonight his new clothes were neatly tucked in, his hair still wet from the post-Quidditch shower. The two sat in awkward silence for a moment. Severus cleared his throat and gently placed a cake onto Harry's plate. This are Madame Puddifoot's special recipe, he said. Harry nearly choked on the bite of cake in his mouth. You went into Madame Puddifoot's? He said. Only for the cakes, I assure you. They're remarkable enough to warrant it. Harry's speed in devouring the treat seemed to agree with Severus' opinion. Swallowing a bite, Severus asked, how was Quidditch practice? He asked. Shrugging, Harry said, it was all right. How are classes? They're okay. Did your friends have a nice summer? I guess so. Severus heaved a sigh. It was going to be a long evening. Severus frowned as his fifth-year Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff class diligently copied their assignment from the board. Though he'd never inspired, or sought to, warm feelings in his students, the level of discomfort in the room was disturbingly high. Two of the Hufflepuff boys had their right hands bandaged. The Ravenclaws all seemed physically whole, but almost as skittish as the Hufflepuffs. He was about to criticize the lumpy texture of one Ravenclaw's potion when a choked mewling sound caught his attention. Chauncey has somehow managed to spill his potion over his bandaged hand. His lab partner was frantically poured the neutralizing agent over it. Severus shoved his way through the classroom, grabbed the boy's wrist and tore the bandage away, the incomplete potion burning his fingers, then shoved the wounded hand into a bowl of salve. Chauncey was scrubbing at his face with his left sleeve, mopping away tears. "You'll be fine," Severus said gruffly. He was never very good at the warm and fuzzy part of teaching. A few quiet but firm instructions soon had the class back to work. Severus fetched a roll of gauze and lifted the boy's hand from the soothing potion to examine the damage. While there was only a slight reddening of the undamaged skin, the letters scored into the boy's head were lined with painful blisters. Why on earth anyone would cut letters in their flesh? Severus frowned as he read the words. "I must not be defiant. Chauncey, Garrison, in my office," he roared. The two boys squeaked and made for his office with an unseemly haste. "Baldwin, you're in charge. See that everyone completes their potions and cleans up." Slamming the door behind him, he rounded on the quaking Hufflepuffs. He ripped the bandage from Garrison's hand as well, exposing the same words. "What is this? Are your lives so dull you must mutilate yourselves for entertainment? I know you Hufflepuffs are a pathetic, whiny lot, but this is beyond a comma." "We didn't want to," Chauncey squeaked. "Are your classmates bullying you? We will speak with Professor Sprout." Severus trailed off, the hopeful expressions on the boys' faces unnerving them. We had detention with Professor Umbridge, sir," Garrison whispered. Chapter 24, Subtle Resistance Revised, June 17, 2007. I realized that Hagrid is still on Dumbledore's mission, so Grubbly Plank is currently teaching Comic. I deleted the line that mentioned Umbridge inspecting his class in this chapter. My favorite book was OITP, despite the horrible ending, because Harry was actually smart and proactive, and it had a lot of Sirius. My second favorite was Poe, because, again, Sirius, but also because Voldemort wasn't involved. Kind of a nice change. Third was Kaz, because we learn about Tom Riddle and Parseltongue is just awesome. Frequent reader question. No, Harry does not know that Severus is his father. He has been told that Lily was Voldemort's daughter, though. No, there will be no / involving Harry in this story. No serious romances. I have nothing against those, love them, in fact, but this won't be one. Severus made a vague note to restock his supply of Murtlap essence. Someone had been pilfering his stores. At least they were careful, he mused. The thief had not tried to disguise their pilfering by adding water to the bottle or switching labels, as so many did. Instead, the bottle had been placed behind goldenrod pollen, which he would be using in his fifth-year classes next week. They delayed discovery enough to cover their tracks, yet made certain I'd know of the shortage quickly. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully as he considered the ingredients before him. Harry settled his pile of books on one of the tables in the back of the library, wincing as he jarred his throbbing hand. Hermione gave him a sympathetic look and Ron grimaced angrily, his own hands clenching into impotent fists. "That a broken bar, that bitch," he hissed angrily. "Harry, we have to do something. We can't let Hera." "Ron, just calm down, okay? It's not a big deal, okay? It is a big deal, but we're stuck right now. Don't let it eat at you. We'll think of something." Ron flopped into a chair, thumbing half-heartedly through his potions textbook. Hermione and Harry, however, focused intently on their material, each taking notes in their own way. After 10 minutes, Ron stretched and said, "Oi, there, you bookworms. I'm starving. Let's go raid the kitchens." Hermione didn't even surface from her book. Harry said, "Maybe later, Ron." Ron grumbled and scribbled a few notes, actually unflattering doodles of Snape. "How about some fresh air? It's stuffy in here." "In a little while, Ron." 20 minutes later, a decidedly cranky Ron stood and said, "Merlin, Harry, did you turn into a Ravenclaw over the summer?" Harry fiddled with the cover of his book. Hermione, sensing his anxiety, said to Ron, "Honestly, Ronald, there is nothing wrong with being studious. Some people value their education and Quietly, Harry interrupted. "He said that if I didn't get an exceeds expectations in all my courses, he'd pull me out of Hogwarts." Ron stared at him, his mouth tense and angry. He threw himself back into his chair and said, "So, what goes in a draft of peace again?" Hermione congratulated Harry on his entrance into the Ancient Runes class. Ron ignored them both, immersed in creating flashing cards. Harry, remembering them from his Muggle school years, had made a few as a demonstration. Ron had quickly embraced the idea, only using flashing ink. So now the growing stack of cards flashed in a multitude of colors. Like the rest of the school, and the magical world, judging from the Daily Prophet, Gryffindor was sharply divided. Approximately a quarter of the house agreed with Finnegan, avoiding Harry when possible and eyeing him suspiciously when not. Another quarter, including Neville Longbottom, sided staunchly with Harry. The bulk of the house was undecided, swayed to and fro by the venomous articles in the Prophet and the arguments of Harry's supporters. Having learned from his previous shunning during the heir of Slytherin panic of his second year, ironic, that Harry wasn't bothering to defend himself. Back then, he'd been frightened and ashamed and angry, but this year, he just didn't care. Things would work out, or not. He had the support of a few, and the many could just go hang. He was, however, keeping a mental note of the ones who came up to him to offer their support. Usually it was quiet and furtive, but it was still support, and Harry valued it. Harry smacked his forehead after Cho Chang left the owlery. Man, he was such a dork. She'd been nice enough to help him out, at least. After sending Sirius's letter off with Hedwig, he tied a second letter to one of the school owls after Hedwig was out of sight. He didn't want her to feel jealous. After all, he fed the brown owl a treat, and said, "Please take this to Flourish and Blots." The owl twittered at Harry and launched himself into the night sky. Sunday, September 8th. Harry scowled as Ron finished reading Percy's letter. He said acidly, "Your brother has a very convenient memory, doesn't he?" Seeing Ron's misery, he forced himself to lighten his tone. "Well, if you want to. What is it?" He checked Percy's letter. "Oh yeah, sever ties with me. I swear I won't get violent." They both laughed, though Harry had a sick feeling in his stomach. Sure, Ron was laughing if off now, but if forced to choose, which way would the Weasleys swing? Percy was blood, after all. Harry was just a stray they'd been kind enough to take in. Nobody, not even Harry, could reasonably expect them to take his side. That evening, smiling past the tight feeling in his throat, Harry waited for Sirius at the Gryffindor hearth. "How are you doing, kiddo?" Sirius asked. He looked much worse than he had a few days ago, his eyes darting about restlessly. "I'm okay." "Things are tense here." Sirius grimaced. "Be careful, Harry. That Umbridge woman, she's dangerous. The Ministry's looking for an excuse to drive Dumbledore out, and she's there to make one. I already got a week's worth of detention. I'll try to keep my head down." "You do that." Say ... Hogsmeade's weekend coming up. How about we have a little Godfather, sometime? We can meet in that cave. Harry opened his mouth to discourage him, but caught the desperate look in his godfather's eyes. Stalling, he asked, "Is that okay with Dumbledore? What he doesn't know won't hurt him." His laugh had a slightly shrill edge. "I think it's too dangerous. Umbridge is bound to have people watching for disobedient students," he continued quickly, forestalling Sirius' disappointment. "How about Wednesday before dinner? I've got Hagrid's class right before then. We can meet at his place. You can play with Fang." Sirius studied him thoughtfully. "You're a lot more cautious than James." Harry bristled. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. I mean, it's probably a good thing. I just wish you didn't need to be, that's all." Monday, September 9th. "Hogwarts High Inquisitor?" Ron gasped, reading the paper. "What kind of rubbish is that?" "The bad kind," Harry said grimly. Harry racked his brain for a question he could ask Trelawney. Sure, she was always predicting his death, which, he realized, was quite unprofessional, but she really was harmless, and he certainly didn't want to see her cry. "Professor, I wanted to ask you about a dream I had last night," he blurted. Fiddling with the filmy scarf at her throat, she blinked at him a few times. A dream, Mr. Potter?" she said. "Yes, I was turned into a frog," he said, seizing on the High Inquisitor's flabby face for inspiration. "There was a red frog and a green frog and a blue frog. I was purple." And then a broken bar. He groped for some terrible fate that could befall froggy kind. Then our pond dried up, and a big black doga, I think it was the Grim, it came and ate the blue frog. Harry resisted the urge to shrink down in his seat. Most of these people thought he was nutters anyway. Sitting forward earnestly, he continued, "It felt so real. Professor, does it mean anything?" "Well, Mr. Potter, colors in our dreams are often important keys sent to us from the beyond." A broken bar as she nattered on about what his being a purple frog meant. He could swear she gave him a look of gratitude. Tuesday, September 10th. Breakfast began with the tension that was becoming, regrettably, the norm. Umbridge, ostentatiously wearing her new High Inquisitor badge, surveyed the incoming mail with beady eyes. As a gray-brown owl began to circle Harry, she rose to her feet and bustled towards the Gryffindor table, pig-like eyes snapping triumphantly. "Dung Bumps," Filch shrilled. "I knew it." Bratz ordered. "Dung Bumps, I'll handle this, Mr. Filch, don't you worry," Umbridge said in her twittering voice. Professor McGonagall hurried towards her. "Really, Professor Umbridge, the students have a right to private correspondence." Umbridge adjusted the sparkling badge on her robes with her stubby fingers. "If Mr. Potter has nothing to hide, then I'm sure he won't mind." "That's circular logic, Hermione began. Harry gave her a warning look. "That's my package, Professor, and I'd prefer it remained private," he said, forcing himself to sound calm and adult. "Now, Mr. Potter, as Hogwarts High Inquisitor, it's my duty to prevent illicit items from entering the school." She held her arm towards the owl. The owl deposited its burden in the bee-ringed hands. It waited patiently for a treat, twittering irritably when Umbridge ignored it. Umbridge cut the twine with a murmured spell, and eagerly tore into the brown paper. "Potions Journal," McGonagall read, her voice ringing through the quiet hall. Turning quite an unbecoming shade of red, Umbridge hissed, "Finite incantatum." At each journal. When the spell revealed nothing, she paged through the books, finding only blank pages. "What is this, Potter?" she snapped. Keeping his voice calm and respectful, Harry said, "I got one over the summer, Professor. It's been so helpful I wanted to give them to my friends." Fuming, Umbridge shoved the books into his hands and stomped away. Grinning, Harry handed one each to Ron, Hermione, and Neville. "I'm sure these will help us get ready for our OWLs," he said, keeping his tone innocent. Draco pinned his inquisitorial squad badge to his robes. Should have made it a rat, he thought, thoroughly disgruntled by his position as one of Umbridge's toadies. Sure, he got to take house points, endlessly amusing, that, and terrorize the younger years. But he and the others also had to attend endless meetings with Umbridge, reporting on the smallest transgressions of the other students and drinking cups of cheap, overly sweet tea, while most of the inquisitorial squad was trying to surreptitiously undermine Umbridge's efforts. It was no coincidence that many of Voldemort's followers were highly influential in the Ministry. Pansy was actively aiding and abetting the enemy, though perhaps she didn't quite get that Umbridge was, in fact, the enemy. Draco was furiously spinning legends and tales out of whole cloth, giving Hogwarts even more poltergeists, ghosts, and secret passages than it actually had, and that was quite a few, and other mysterious beings to which all sorts of odd happenings could be attributed. They were all struggling to turn the horrid woman's attention away from Potter and onto Dumbledore and Hogwarts herself. Of course, most of the other houses only saw the lost points and piled up detentions. Being a good guy really was thankless. Draco wondered what Potter saw in it. The first-year Gryffindors and Ravenclaws tried not to fidget as they read their books quietly. They all knew what had happened to Harry, after all. And if Harry wasn't safe from Umbridge, then no one was. Umbridge fanned herself and sipped water from her glass. She really was feeling dreadful, making a mental note to have the house elves responsible for this morning's breakfast flogged. She peered narrowly at the quiet class in front of her. She'd been so sure that most of the students and staff would show throat as soon as she applied a little persuasion, especially to their precious boy hero. While she was certainly feared, she still got very little cooperation. The younger students all said, "Yes ma'am," and "No ma'am," in soft, fearful voices, but they never came tattling to her. They replied to her questions about suspicious happenings with, "I don't know, Professor," or maybe it was Peeves. A handful simply broke into noisy sobs whenever she spoke to them, which was very discomfiting. She pressed a shaking hand to her cheek, feeling hot and dizzy. Martin Gooseberry looked up from his book. Professor Umbridge certainly didn't look well. Her face was even rounder than normal, and flushed red. Using the shorthand his cousin Eddie had taught him for note-taking, it was a convenient code, too. He wrote on the charmed square of his parchment, "Umbridge appears to be ill." In the same code, his cousin replied, "When she hits the floor, use a nerve 8. Stoke the hysteria if you can." Gryffs don't get hysterical, they go into foaming barbarian rages. That will suffice. A few moments later, The professor stumbled out of her chair, clawing at her throat and choking for breath. "Professor!" piped a small voice. Umbridge pointed her wand at her throat, but couldn't get enough breath to cast. When she fell to the floor, face mottled in ugly purple, Martin shrieked, "Oh Merlin, she's dying!" "Finite incantatum!" one brave Gryffindor shouted. Martin was quite impressed when the enhancement charms on Umbridge's hair fizzled, revealing the thinning grizzled mop. "Enervate!" Martin called, as Eddie had instructed. Umbridge started foaming at the mouth. This was the most interesting defense class of the year, Martin had decided. Severus ignored the headmaster's disapproving stare. Usually, that stare left him feeling small and ashamed. But this time, he held a moral high ground, and he was quite enjoying it. "Madame Pomfrey assures me that Professor Umbridge will recover. Apparently she is allergic to something in the castle." "The dungeons are a bit mildewy," Flitwick said mildly. "Quite a few of my Ravenclaws over the years have been allergic as well." He and Severus shared a self-righteous smirk. The jolly little man had quite happily been Severus's accomplice in this act of targeted bioterrorism. "It is fortunate they've never become terribly ill." Then, Dumbledore said, transferring that stare to Charms Professor, "Hogwarts welcomed them, didn't she?" he said. Flitwick was an elitist in his own way. For him, anyone invited to attend Hogwarts, Bukes, Batons and Durmstrang were moderately acceptable, were all at least potentially worthy wizards and witches. Everyone else was second class. To him, a Muggle-born was just as good as a pure-blood, as long as they received a letter. Poor little Dolores had never received a letter. The fact that she deigned to pass judgment on children, much less adults, who had was quite galling. Realizing that a quiet mutiny was brewing, Dumbledore let it go. As long as everyone believed it was an allergy, then hopefully the Ministry's fangs would be drawn. For a time,